I am a chronicler of Quel'Thalas, and this is the story of Kael'thas Sunstrider, not the way the songs have already begun to smooth it into something cleaner, but the way it actually happened. He was not born ruined. Whatever he later became, in whatever tower, under whatever demon's influence, began as a prince who loved his kingdom plainly and who spent most of his adult life trying, in his own imperfect way, to save it. He was the only son of Anasterian Sunstrider, High King of Quel'Thalas, and the last of the House of Sunstrider. He was also, in his own right, a powerful mage, gifted enough to sit as a senior member of the Council of Six, the shadowy inner leadership of the Kirin Tor in Dalaran. Most of his adult life, before everything changed, was split between those two cities. Dalaran, where his standing among the Kirin Tor's elite grew steadily, and Silvermoon, where he returned when he could, never quite living fully in either place. He was not a cold man, whatever the later stories made of him. I remember him returning from Dalaran one season, having heard a young musician named Lirith Windrunner perform at a gathering, and being so taken with the boy's talent that he became his patron outright, moved him into Silvermoon's artists' quarter, found him an apprenticeship, and eventually saw him appointed royal musician. That was not the act of someone incapable of warmth. He simply reserved it selectively, the way princes often learn to. He briefly considered courting Lirith's older sister, Sylvanas, in those years, a courtship that ended before it began, when she made her disinterest clear after an embarrassing moment at a remembrance ball. There was friction between them again not long after, when Kael'thas objected to a human, Nathanos Maris, being admitted into the Farstriders under Sylvanas's command, and sent word to Quel'Thalas demanding she reconsider. I do not know how that particular dispute resolved. I only know it was one of several small frictions that marked his relationship with the Windrunner family, long before either of them could have guessed what still lay ahead for both their houses. He had, for a time, pursued someone else too, Lady Jaina Proudmoore, whose company he clearly enjoyed and whose regard he clearly wanted. She found him charming, by every account I ever heard. But her heart had already settled elsewhere, on a young prince of Lordaeron named Arthas Menethil, and it was Arthas she chose in the end. Arthas, for his part, came to view the older, more accomplished Kael'thas with open jealousy, long before either of them had any notion how much worse things between them would eventually get. He held hard opinions in those years too, not all of which I'm proud to pass on unquestioned. He argued more than once, and more publicly than was wise, that the orcs held in the Alliance's internment camps didn't deserve the mercy that Jaina, Antonidas, and Arthas kept extending them, that their inability to master their own dependency on demon blood proved, to his mind, that they weren't worth saving. It is not lost on me, telling this story now, how that argument would eventually come back around on the man who made it. He was present, too, in the halls of Dalaran when Kel'Thuzad was expelled from the Kirin Tor for his dealings with the Lich King. One voice among the Council of Six, watching a colleague's fall from grace that, in hindsight, should perhaps have worried all of them more than it did. He was in Dalaran, not Silvermoon, when it happened. Prince Arthas, the same young man who had won Jaina's heart, and who Kael'thas had never fully stopped resenting for it, turned his corrupted army north into Quel'Thalas. What followed was not a battle so much as an erasure. Silvermoon City was destroyed. The high elven forests were defiled. Nearly 9 in every 10 of his people were killed. And the Sunwell itself, the wellspring every elf in that kingdom had drawn on since before any living memory, was left defiled and twisted by the scourge's passing. His father, King Anasterian, died defending what was left of it. Kael'thas learned all of this from Dalaran after the fact, too far away to have done anything to stop it. Jaina came to him, meaning to offer comfort. He did not let her have the chance. Whatever she tried to say, he threw back at her, accusing her of loving a butcher, reminding her one final time that she had chosen Arthas over him. I do not think that accusation was truly about Arthas, not entirely. I think it was easier in that moment to be furious at the person standing in front of him than to sit inside a grief with nowhere else to go. He cursed humanity outright, called himself a fool for ever believing it could be trusted to help his people, and declared that whatever his people became from here forward, they would be reborn from the blood of everyone forced to serve her beloved in death. I do not believe he understood, saying it, that he had just given his shattered people the name they would carry for the rest of their history. He abandoned Dalaran to whatever fate awaited it and rushed for home, sending word ahead through Romath to Lor'themar Theron, who had been left holding together what little remained of the kingdom, that their prince was finally on his way. Kael'thas arrived home to an icy reception. His people had endured their darkest hour without him, and his prolonged absence in Dalaran had not gone unnoticed. There was real, quiet fear in those first days that their prince might simply choose not to come back at all. He made no excuses for it. I will admit, telling this honestly, that he never had an easy relationship with his own people. Quel'Thalas has always been insular, inward-facing, content within its own borders. Kael'thas was never built that way. He wanted the wider world, other races, other cities, other ideas, and I think some part of his own people never fully trusted him for it, even as they depended on him. He went first to Lor'themar, who had rallied what elves remained in his absence and was brought to his father's body. He performed the blessing himself in the old tongue and told Anasterion plainly that he felt lost without him, that his father was the king, not him, and that he needed a strength he wasn't certain he had. That night, he watched Anasterion burn on a funeral pyre of his own arranging. Then he went to see what remained of the Sunwell itself. What he found there frightened him more than the ruins of his own capital had. The scourge had defiled it on their way through, and what was left pulsed with something dark and wrong. Not simply extinguished, but actively dangerous to anything that came near it. Fearing it would draw in the Amani trolls for whatever scraps of power remained, and fearing worse if it was left to fester, Kael'thas made a choice I don't believe anyone else in his position could have made, and one I don't think he ever spoke of easily afterward. He gathered volunteers, Romath and Astalor blood-sworn chief among them, and destroyed the corrupted Sunwell himself with his own hands rather than let it become something worse than dead. He saved his people from whatever that twisted well might eventually have done to them. He also, in that same act, severed them completely from the only source of magic they had ever known. What followed? The hollow, desperate hunger that came to define the survivors of Quel'Thalas for years afterward was not simply something the Scourge did to his people. It was the price of a choice Kael'thas made himself to spare them something he judged to be even worse. I do not know if he ever forgave himself for that trade. I am not certain it is the kind of thing a person can. When he returned from the Isle of Quel'Danas, he renamed what remained of his people. Blood Elves, he called them, Sindorai, in memory of everyone the Scourge had taken, everyone whose blood, as he'd put it in his fury at Jaina, had bought whatever they were about to become. He decreed that his father would be remembered as the very last king of Quel'Thalas, and left the crown itself unclaimed, taking other titles for himself instead. His father had already withdrawn Quel'Thalas from the alliance before any of this happened. Kael'thas rejoined what remained of it anyway, the scattered resistance still fighting the Scourge across Lordaeron, taking his most capable followers with him and leaving the greater part of his people behind under Lor'themar's regency, safer, he judged, than they would be following him into whatever came next. Before he left, he took his family's shattered runeblade, Felomorn, into his own keeping, already planning to see it reforged into something his people could be proud of again. What came next is stranger than anything I expected to be telling you when I first sat down to give you his story. Kael'thas and his soldiers were camped in Silverpine Forest, dealing with undead disturbances rippling out from the direction of Dalaran, when two night elves found him, Maiev Shadowsong and Tyrande Whisperwind, who had been chasing Illidan Stormrage across the sea for 3 days straight. Kael'thas, putting the pieces together, guessed that Illidan might be behind the trouble stirring near Dalaran, and told them so. Tyrande, hopeful, offered her help, finding Illidan in exchange for his. Maiev thought it a waste of time, but agreed to it anyway. They fought their way toward Pyrewood Village together, night elves and blood elves and the mountain giants who'd allied with them, retrieving supply caches Kael'thas had buried earlier in his retreat. Along the way, Tyrande asked him where the rest of his people were. He told her plainly what had happened to Quel'Thalas. She did not try to talk him out of the anger that answer clearly still carried. She only warned him that vengeance was not a pleasant road to walk, which he found easy to agree with in the moment and, I suspect, harder to actually practice. At Pyrewood, the undead were waiting. The first wave, they turned back together. The second nearly overran them, and as the caravan fled across a bridge, Tyrande stayed behind alone to hold the line, calling on Elun's protection as the bridge gave way beneath her and the river swept her from sight. Kael'thas wanted to go back for her. Maiev stopped him. She was a warrior, Maiev said, and knew exactly what risk she'd taken, and held him to their bargain, help her find Illidan first. They tracked him to the ruins of Dalaran, where Kyle's own scouts found him in the middle of some strange ritual involving a glowing, ancient gem. Malfurion arrived close behind, warning that his brother's spell was tearing apart the foundations of Northrend itself. In the chaos that followed, the spell was broken, and Malfurion turned on his own twin, certain that Tyrande's death was Illidan's doing. Kael'thas, of all people in that room, was the one who pointed out that it was far too soon to assume she was truly gone, for which Maiev silenced him sharply enough that he didn't try again. Malfurion, it turned out, had been playing a longer game than any of them realized. He freed Illidan outright and left with him to search for Tyrande himself, leaving Maiev tangled in vines of her own brother's making. She eventually broke free and gave chase. Kael'thas was left standing alone in the wreckage of Dalaran, no closer to understanding what he'd just been part of than when it started. It was in those same ruins that he finally found the human officer he'd actually been sent to answer to. Grand Marshal Othmar Garithos, who dismissed Kael'thas's account of night elves and Illidan and glowing artifacts as exactly the sort of fanciful excuse he'd come to expect from anyone under his command who wasn't human. Garithos made no particular effort to hide his contempt for the rest. He told Kael'thas a strike force was closing in through the mountains and that he'd handle it himself. Kael'thas, he judged, would be more useful repairing the kingdom's arcane observatories so that a second eastern threat could at least be spotted coming. Kael'thas did as he was told and found the shipyard at Lordamere Lake in ruins, with no way across the water to reach the observatories at all. It was Lady Vashj, a Naga witch, who solved that for him, citing some old, shared ancestry between Naga and elves, and offering boats before he'd finished explaining the trouble he was in. When Garithos learned that Kael'thas had accepted aid from Naga, he was furious and warned him plainly that he would not tolerate treason. Not long after, new orders arrived. The observatories had spotted an undead force moving in from the west, and Kael'thas was to deal with it. though Garithos had also recalled every human soldier and support team back to the main front, leaving Kael'thas with nothing but his own elves to face what was coming. The undead nearly overran them. Vashj returned again, insisting they would not survive without her help, and this time, out of options, Kael'thas accepted. It was in the aftermath of that fight that he finally told Vashj the truth of what had been eating at him and his people since Quel'Thalas fell. The emptiness, the hunger that no rest ever seemed to ease. She told him plainly what it was, the same hunger her own people carried, the same dependency on magic that ordinary rest could never satisfy. Without the Sunwell, she told him, his people would eventually suffer a fatal withdrawal, the same as any Naga cut off from its own source. Garithos was approaching as they spoke. Kael'thas told Vashj to flee. Whether she moved too slowly or his men were simply watching more closely than either of them realized, the sight of a Naga escaping was all the proof Garithos needed. He had Kael'thas and every elf serving under him arrested for treason on the spot and thrown into the dungeons of Dalaran. Vashj came for them. She slipped through the sewers beneath the dungeons, freed Kael'thas first, and helped him free the rest of his people in turn, promising an escape through a portal that Kel'Thuzad himself had left standing open, with her own master waiting on the far side. On the way out, Kael'thas came face to face with a former comrade turned jailer, and was forced to kill him to clear their path. What remained of his people fled through that portal and out of Azeroth entirely, into a shattered alien world that had once, he later learned, been the orcish homeland of Draenor. Illidan's storm rage was waiting for him there. Illidan told him plainly what he wanted: help closing the demonic gateways scattered across this broken realm in exchange for what Kael'thas's people needed most badly. Kael'thas asked, without much hope left in the asking, whether Illidan could actually cure his people of their addiction. Illidan told him there was no cure, but promised that if Kael'thas joined him, he would see the Blood Elves fed enough magical energy that the hunger would never be allowed to consume them. Kael'thas pledged himself to Illidan that same day. I understand now, telling this whole story start to finish, rather than in the scattered pieces I first gave you, why he said yes so quickly. By that point, he had already lost his father, his kingdom, the woman he'd once hoped to marry, and the good opinion of the very alliance he'd bled to defend. Illidan was the first person in longer than I like to count who offered him something that sounded like an actual answer, instead of one more reason to wait, endure, and hope things improved on their own. Whether that answer turned out to be the right one belongs to a different telling than this one. But I understand, at least, why a desperate prince said yes the moment it was finally, genuinely offered. I do not know, even now, exactly where the boy I watched grow up ends and the figure the rest of Azeroth eventually came to fear begins. I know only what I watched with my own eyes. A boy who once moved a struggling musician into better lodgings out of simple admiration, grown into a prince who destroyed his own people's holiest place with his own hands to spare them something worse, buried his father the same night he found him, and said yes to the first real offer of help he'd received in over a year, from the one figure none of the rest of us would ever have trusted with anything. I have never been able to convince myself he was simply a villain from the start. I think, more often, he was a prince who ran out of people willing to actually help him save what was left of his kingdom, and went looking for it wherever it was, finally, honestly offered. And that the real tragedy of his story is how understandable that choice was for as long as it remained one.